now we're looking at the orbit of the skull, and we can see some, nasal cavity here, and we can see the zygomatic arch back here. But the key thing that we want to look at when we're talking about the maxillary division of trigeminal nerve, where the inferior orbital fissure meets the superior orbital fissure. And it's this little patch just deep in the corner here. And that little patch just in there has a little area which is, you can just see just there, where the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve exits, just behind the orbit in a little tiny space. And let's remember that little tiny space is about the size of a quarter of your fingernail, your little fingernail, and it's called the Palatine fossa. For short, we call that PPF. And that pterygopalatine fossa, a little tiny space just behind the orbit where the inferior orbital fissure and the superior orbital fissure meet, is where the maxillary division of trigeminal nerve comes out from foramen rotundum. So the other end of foramen rotundum is that little dark spot you can see in the middle of the red circle there. The other thing to add to this is, do remember that we talked about it earlier, but that pterygoid canal also comes out in the PPF, and it sends its parasympathetic fibres and its sympathetic fibres into this little PPF, pterygopalatine fossa. And this is the key place where all the branching of the maxillary division of trigeminal nerve then happens from. So we are going to focus on this space here and talk about what happens in this little space. Now, to make life easier, you can't actually see easily in that little area there. So to understand the pterygopalatine fossa, we actually describe that little space and we imagine that we are standing in it. We imagine it's a little cube. And we imagine that we are standing inside that cube and looking around at all the surfaces that make up the cube. For example, when you stand in that cube, the front surface here is actually the back here of the maxillary antrum, and the little bit at the top here, that little bit just there, is the inferior orbital fissure. Inferior orbital fissure. Inferior orbital fissure. And you can see it right there, just in front of that little red spot is the infraorbital fissure. And in fact, there's something really neat on this skull that you don't often see. Can you see this groove just running through here, down there, and then this foramen just here? This is, and in fact that groove dives through the bone here and just comes out sort of there like that. That groove is the branch, that groove and that foramen is the pathway of one of the major branches of the maxillary division of trigeminal nerve that comes out through there, comes out along that groove like that, runs down there to come out on the face just here, and that's called the infraorbital nerve. That's the first branch of the maxillary division of trigeminal nerve, and if we imagine this original pterygopalatine fossa as a cube, the infraorbital branch is the branch that comes out through the front wall of the cube. We will now move on and talk about this cube. I'm going to redraw it, and we're going to talk about the other walls, what makes up the other walls, and what foramina in it, and what branches go through it. But this, since we've got it here, is a lovely view of the infraorbital branch coming out onto the face. So let's now start talking about this cube that is the pterygopalatine fossa. And we'll think about what each of the walls, oops-a-daisy, let's fix that up, of this cube are made of. What bones are represented in them. And remember, there is a left and right pterygopalatine fossa. And we'll dot in these back sides here like this. So we're just doing one of them, but obviously there is one on the other side as well. So we've already done the front wall here. We've said that the front wall is made up of the back of the maxilla, and this little region at the top of the front wall, we've said, is the inferior orbital fissure, and we've sent a branch through that wall. Now we should remember that the back wall, down the very back here, has our friend Foramen rotundum in it, Foramen rotundum, and this is where the main branch, well, this is where the maxillary division of trigeminal nerve is going to come through, and just below it, still in that back wall back there, it also has the pterygoid canal, where the parasympathetic and the sympathetic components, remember, parasympathetic from the 7th nerve, is also going to come to enter the pterygopalatine fossa. So they are the entry points in the back wall. We'll choose blue. The medial wall, so this wall over here, we're going to call this side medial. The medial wall has a hole in it, and it has a hole like this. What I call an upside down mouse hole. It has a hole that's sort of a half circle in it, and that is called the Sphenoid Palatine foramen. And the reason it's called the Sphenopalatine foramen is that this roof, the top of the top here, the roof, that is sphenoid bone. And in fact there are no foraminae and there are no branches through the roof. The sphenoid bone is solid, and above it is actually the cranial cavity. So there is nothing there, no foraminae in that roof. So you can understand now that this sort of bit of the bone that makes up this foramen is the sphenoid bone, and I think you can already guess that the actual medial wall itself, this area here, this medial wall, is palatine bone. So to call the foramen the Sphenopalatine foramen makes sense, because half of the whole is made from sphenoid bone, the top ridge of it, and the rest of it is made of palatine bone. And a large branch of the maxillary nerve runs through that Sphenopalatine foramen. And then now let's look at the lateral side. In fact, why don't we redraw this cube, because we're getting a little bit messy here, aren't we? So let's move down here and just quickly redraw one as quickly as I can. So this roof that I've just drawn in, that sphenoid bone, the front is maxilla with the inferior orbital fissure here. Lateral wall we're going to talk about in 2 seconds. And we've talked about the medial wall. Let's draw that in back here. Oops, I should have dotted that in. Let's just dot the rest of it in. That medial wall is made of palatine bone. And we're dotting in the back wall, which we remind ourselves is actually made of sphenoid bone, but that has the foramen rotundum in the back wall there, and the pterygoid canal just below it there. So let's talk about this lateral wall now, and what that's made of. We'll call this the lateral wall. And the lateral wall is actually sort of a gap or an opening. We call it a fissure. Sort of like that. And it's the fissure is called the pterygomaxillary fissure. And the reason it's called the pterygomaxillary fissure, I think you probably worked out for yourself. Remember I said to you that, let's just draw our friend the inferior orbital fissure in. This bone here, this front part here, this bone here, is the back of the maxilla, isn't it? So this runs all the way over here. So this part of the medial wall is also part of the maxilla. So that makes sense because that makes the maxilla part of this name. And the other part of the name, I'll just remind you, this back wall, remember I told you that the back wall back here is actually part of the sphenoid bone? Back here. And in fact, this little part here is actually part of the sphenoid bone too, but it's a special part of the sphenoid bone. It's the pterygoid plates. Of the sphenoid bone, sitting right there. So that then makes sense that this little fissure, or this gap that opens up laterally, is called the pterygomaxillary fissure. There it is there, a little opening. And we're left with only one surface to talk about, and that is the floor of this space, this area down under here. Try and draw an arrow up under there. That floor, and there is actually no floor. It's completely open down that way. And in the end, if you head down this way, you end up at the back of the palate, heading downward. So we've now looked at the pterygopalatine fossa in detail. Remember, this is only one, and remember also that this is this tiny little space poked in behind the orbit that has all of the branching of the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve, and that's what we're trying to understand. So let's make ourselves a little systematic approach to understanding this now. So we're talking about the pterygopalatine fossa, and you can go back in the video and look at all the surfaces, but we are now talking about the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve and all its branches that happens at the pterygopalatine fossa. And all we need to do now is, if we imagine our cube, we can talk about the different surfaces of the cube. We can talk about the front surface, and that has a branch of the maxillary division, and that branch is called the infraorbital nerve. We can then give ourselves, let's say, the front surface, let's say the medial surface. Let's then put down the lateral surface next. Let's then put down the floor. Then we'll put down the roof, We've done the front, we haven't done the back, posterior. We've done the front. And lastly, just to make it symmetric, we'll put down the back, the posterior. We've missed something, but we'll come to it in a bit. So then we just plonk a branch through each of these. Now the good news is the posterior surface to reflect the front surface, we should probably call that anterior, but we won't for now. The posterior surface has really no branches, because that is where the maxillary division actually came through there, plus its parasympathetic and sympathetic add-ons came through there to then spread out through these branches. The medial surface has a branch called, well, it has two branches actually, the long and the short Sphenoid nerve, and they are ending up in the nasal cavity. And because the nasal cavity is the next structure to the medial side of the pterygopalatine fossa. Now, laterally, remember we said laterally was that fissure, the pterygomaxillary fissure, and we send through the pterygomaxillary fissure a branch called the posterior superior alveolar nerve. And you will hear about that on another video where I talk about the innervation of the upper jaw, the posterior superior alveolar nerve. And through the floor we send a branch called the greater, well, a couple of branches, or lesser, the two branches, greater or lesser, palatine nerves. And remember that they are going to head off to the palate. And very lastly, the roof. The good news is the roof has none. So these are all the branches of the maxillary division of trigeminal nerve. And it all happens in the pterygopalatine fossa. That's the key structure to understand. I just want to add one little thing before we finish, and that is the infraorbital nerve has some additional branches that you'll see talked about. It has some sub-branches called the anterior superior alveolar nerve and the middle superior alveolar nerve, and those two nerves with their partner, the posterior superior alveolar nerve, are the key nerves supplying the teeth and gums of the upper teeth. So the key to this story is the pterygopalatine fossa. And just to go back and do a last little reminder, we'll go to the top here. Remember that the pterygopalatine fossa is a little cube about the size of a quarter of your fingernail, and it has a whole bunch of foramen in it. If you think of the cube as surfaces, you can think of the medial surface having the sphenopalatine foramen in it, and remind you that the branch running out through there, you now know, is the long and the short sphenopalatine nerve. The branch running out through the front wall is called the infraorbital nerve. The branch running out through the lateral wall is called the posterior superior alveolar nerve. The branch running out through the floor is called the greater and lesser palatine nerves. And remember that in the back wall is where the maxillary division and the autonomic components come through. In a separate video, I'll talk all about these autonomic components, and you can see how they intertwine with the maxillary division of the trigeminal nerve. Thank you.